I am Chris Sturm, the Watershed Program Director with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. We are an agency within Colorado State's government Department of Natural Resources. We're the what you call the primary water policy agency for the state of Colorado. I'm in the watershed and flood protection section. We have an in-stream flow protection section where we have water rights to protect the natural environment in channel. We have a finance section where we do loans for water projects. We just completed our second iteration of Colorado's water plan. And then, of course, we look at interstate issues, the biggest of which lately is the Colorado River issue. So, just to give you guys a rough idea of what we do at the agency, today I'm talking about wildfire ready watersheds, which is a statewide post fire susceptibility analysis. Um, Now, you guys are with the EPA, so forgive some of these slides. They'll be a little simple for you, but I'm used to talking to a lot of local elected officials and legislators. But um, I manage what we call the watershed health program for the state of Colorado. And it's good for us to visit kind of the why of what we're doing as we approach new programs like the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. We don't operate these things in a vacuum. We dovetail them into existing things that we have. And, big thing for us in having healthy watersheds is we want to maintain our flow regimes at historic conditions or as close to historic conditions as we possibly can as we're facing climate change. And of course, a lot of people, when they hear flow regimes, they're thinking about the magnitude of water that comes down. And that's important, but we're also concerned about the timing of when that water comes down and the rate of change, how quickly it comes down, and the duration. So, all elements of flow regime. We want our watersheds to be resilient. We want them to be able to resist, absorb, and recover from natural disasters. So, fire's a big one. Some of the strategies I'll be outlining today also apply to drought. We provide water for the state for different uses. All of those uses are important to us: agricultural uses, municipal, industrial, environmental, and recreational. Those are our big five. And then, of course, we're interested in maintaining and enhancing our habitat for aquatic and terrestrial species. So, in our state, we have a lot of streams that I call underachievers. They look pretty good from far, but they're far from good. And that's what we're looking at here in this valley. That's Rocky Mountain National Park, the Kawanichi Valley. And it is really an incised channel through what was once a wet meadow beaver complex. And due to agricultural practices at the time, it was channelized and drained, and it's been allowed to kind of do its own thing for probably close to a century, but never really reconnected with its floodplain. So we're losing a lot of the functions of a healthy watershed that we could get out of that. And we have a lot of these examples around the state. We have examples of well-functioning streams, but again, lots of underachievers on our landscape that we could be making improvements upon. So, in our legislative session a couple years ago through Senate Bill 21-240, the General Assembly said, "Hey, CWCB, again, we're the Colorado Water Conservation Board. You're going to assess the susceptibility of Colorado's water resources, communities, and infrastructure for post-wildfire impacts." So that's the important piece of what I'm talking about today. We're preparing for post-wildfire impacts. We looked at that legislation and said, yeah, we can do that and give some statewide data sets that'll be pretty good. But if we really want to affect change out there, we're going to have to take it a little bit further. So the bill mandated us to do the first part. It gave us about a year and a half to get it done. But we also built this framework for communities so they could do the same type of susceptibility analysis, but in a much more detailed fashion, so that they could develop mitigation strategies to minimize post wildfire impacts, and that they could do this planning before they have wildfires and develop these mitigation strategies and give themselves ideas of what is a good suite of projects to implement before we have a fire and what's a good suite of projects that we would consider after a fire. This slide pretty much sums it up. I could give the whole presentation with this one. If you guys have done any technical work with consultants before, I highly advise getting an illustrator on the team. It has just been wonderful for us to communicate some of our stuff to the general public. But what we did is we looked at post-wildfire susceptibility by saying we have values at risk on our landscape, and we have these post-wildfire hazards. And where they intersect is where we're susceptible. So values at risk, absent post-wildfire hazards, which is the eastern third of our state, roughly, isn't a big part of this study. We have grass fires that we worry about, but we don't see this erosion and debris flows and really significant increased flooding after those fires. So not really susceptible. Other areas, we have the intersection of these things in a lot of places. So we looked at big data sets. We got our aquatic ecosystems data sets from our local Colorado Parks and Wildlife Agency, another agency within DNR. That has to do with a lot of sport fisheries, endangered species, gold medal fisheries, things like that are in that layer. We went to our Division of Water Resources and got a layer of all our jurisdictional dams. We have municipal water intakes from our Department of Public Health and Environment. We got our agricultural water infrastructure, and that includes the actual diversions on the stream channels, as well as the infrastructure, the ditches, the irrigation ditches as they exist across the landscape. Then we talked to transportation folks and brought in road crossings as a really important value at risk. And then we used some First Street data. That's stuff that FEMA usually plays around with for the National Flood Insurance Program for our life and property layer. So we looked at lots of different things that we could do with statewide data sets, but these were the ones that we culled the list down to. We thought this would really capture it. Then we built some hazard layers, hill slope erosion. We used a revised universal soil loss equation to develop a statewide hill slope erosion layer. We used some USGS or regression models to build debris flow pathways. Water quality is a huge concern after fires. We're kind of letting the rest of these hazards be a proxy for that, but I will talk about how we've addressed that in post-fire scenarios. We have a fluvial hazard zone mapping program that the CWCB has created through my section, and that's really the patterns of erosion sedimentation that happen within the stream channels and the propensity for channels to avulse and migrate across their floodplain. So that's a layer that we used. We're advocating for that fluvial hazard zone mapping in our local planning efforts, but for the statewide effort, we used 500-year floodplains as a proxy for that. And then finally, what we did was a rough hydrologic model for the entire state with pre-fire conditions, and then ran that model again with different burn scenarios across it, low, medium, and high burn severity. And we aggregated that and looked at the departure of flows between a pre and post fire scenario, and came up with a statewide flooding layer. So that's a lot of information. At the end of this, I'll direct you guys to the website where you can read about the data sets that we have. So I'm going to show you guys some maps of the results for the statewide study. And what you're looking at is this green to red spectrum. And as we get from green to red, we see higher presence of values at risk intersecting with increasing presence of these post-wildfire hazards. So that's what you'll be looking at. We did it at USGS Hydrologic Unit Code 12. So HUC 12, for those of you that know that. Those are pretty small watersheds, about 10,000 to 40,000 acres in size. And we have roughly 4,500 of those in the state of Colorado. So here's the results. No big surprise for us, which is why when I looked at the legislation, I'm like, we got to do more than just create a statewide data set because we know where we have these things. For those of you who are familiar with the geography of Colorado, what you're looking at there, where the colors are red and orange, kind of in the middle of the state, that's our Front Range where the plains meet the mountains. And we have lots of diversions, lots of infrastructure and developments. So it's no big surprise that they're lighting up. And then as we get into some of our populated mountain areas, we see more concern. I don't want the colors to mislead folks. I have a grant program to fund our local frameworks that I'll be talking about, and we're not necessarily using this map to make decisions on who gets funding and who doesn't. There could be a community that has one reservoir that is incredibly important to them as their only source of water, and we would of course consider them for funding for a wildfire ready action plan, even if they weren't in our yellow to red spectrum. Although most folks we're hearing from so far are in these really orange and red colored areas. Our legislators don't think in watershed boundaries really well, so we messed around with the data a little bit, aggregated it, averaged it, I should say, across counties so we could get a better picture of which counties are at highest risk. And then I wanted to look at it at a bigger watershed scale, the HUC 8 scale, because a lot of our watershed groups in this state are formed around that geographic scale. And so this just gives us different ways to look at the data. We also have a Susceptibility Explorer on our website. Different users out there are going to be interested in different post-fire hazards and, more importantly, different values at risk. So we wanted to give folks an opportunity to play around with our data and turn on and off different layers. And the example I have here is reservoirs. A lot of our water users are primarily interested in their reservoirs, and they're mostly interested in their susceptibility to post-wildfire debris flows. Although flooding is a concern for dam safety, and hill slope erosion is also a concern. But what I turned on here is reservoirs susceptible to debris flows. And again, that's just presence of number of reservoirs. And what we also did is we valued the HUC 12s that drain into those reservoirs +1. So we took the HUC 12 that the reservoir's in, and then every HUC 12 that's touching that one that's draining into the reservoir, and actually identified that as a value at risk. So the watershed itself is the value at risk. There's other things that can be played around with on this. I think the aquatic resources one is pretty interesting for a lot of our environmental groups. So let's get to the local framework, the second half of this. This piece here, all these maps here, this satisfied what the bill told us to do. And I think the General Assembly and Department of Natural Resources were pretty pleased. And I hope they use that in a way that brings more money to Colorado so we can mitigate these risks. But we are a state that is pretty proactive. We don't wait around for federal funding to bail us out on things. And developing this wildfire ready action plan, it's coming with, or it came with, it's already been released, a $10 million grant program to implement it. And we will fund up to 75% of the total cost to implement this local framework. And the match requirement, only half of that has to be cash. So I keep telling folks, I'm thinking, $100,000 to $200,000 to pull off one of these plans, and your buy-in on that with cash is $12,500 to $25,000, which a lot of our stakeholders out there through their collaborations can make that happen pretty easily. And then they usually have a lot of in-kind. Now, we have a lot of experience at the board dealing with post-wildfire flooding. We also dealt with and led the effort to restore our streams after the 2013 floods on the Front Range. That was a pretty devastating event for Colorado. And we developed a lessons learned document from that. We spent nearly $70 million on implementation alone of stream restoration projects. And so we took a lot of that information out of our lessons learned and brought it into this action plan. And one of the biggest lessons learned for me was don't just drop a giant book on folks and tell them to read it, and then they'll know what to do. Our action plan is actually just a scope of work, and it is at a level of detail that it can be put right into a request for proposals to hire a technical consultant firm. It can be put right into a grant application back to us and to other funders to get moving. So we're a lot more prescriptive with this grant program than we've ever been on anything before. So what does it look like? Just quickly, it's got 6 major tasks. The first 2 are organized around the social piece of it. Developing goals and objectives with stakeholders is incredibly important. We are a local control state. I should have mentioned at the beginning that my agency is not regulatory. We work with carrots, not sticks, hence the grant program. But we are pretty prescriptive in what we need to see if you're coming to get funding to implement one of these plans. A lot of what needs to be done on the technical end is data collection. And hopefully you guys got a feel for that through the illustration earlier in the slideshow. We want people to bring those same data sets, types of data in, but much more detailed than the statewide data sets that we use. There's a significant portion that goes into analysis. For example, we would like people to use existing or, in their absence, build hydrologic and hydraulic models that look at pre-fire hydrology and hydraulics, and then look at different burn scenarios and get an idea of what that post-fire hydrology is. In the post-fire recovery game, this is one of the hardest things that I work in. We usually have several different agencies, federal and state, doing H&H modeling. The numbers are all over the place. Everybody's trying to figure out which one to go with. And meantime, we have people in harm's way with no mitigation actions being placed. Anyway, then the next step is risk, where we take the data, the value at risk data, and we marry it with that hazard data, and we identify where the risk is. And then finally, and it's not a plan until we identify actions, the plan is all about identifying the pre and post wildfire mitigation actions. We have a lot of fact sheets to support this scope of work. There's a lot of information, and people enter this with varying degrees of knowledge about post-wildfire hazards. So we built a lot of fact sheets that are live linked from the online version of the scope of work. And the quick start guide is really helpful for communities as they're kind of feeling it out and seeing whether or not they want to jump into this. So as I said earlier, we like to build on things we've already done. We don't like to reinvent the wheel. We've done a lot of work in post-wildfire scenarios where we're anticipating these hazards. And the East Troublesome Fire is one. It's the second largest fire in Colorado history. We had the largest fire in Colorado history burn just over the divide from it in the same year at just over 200,000 acres. But the stakeholders from the East Troublesome Fire, which is the Upper Colorado River watershed, they asked us to come in and help them after the fire. And we took this same approach where we said, we need your value at risk data. So the county sent us their structure layer, the water supplier sent us their infrastructure, their raw water supply network, and we built a hydrologic and hydraulic model based on the BEAR report on the burn severity analysis. And we came up with these hotspots where we were like, yeah, we've got significant issues in these communities and these areas of water intake in your burn area or just outside of your burn area. What this did is it really helped the NRCS that has a great post-wildfire recovery program called the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, EWP. They have to go out on site and do what they call damage survey reports, or DSRs. And normally it is just it's a mess where it's like, where should we go? Who's at risk? Well, let's go check out this neighborhood. And you're just working on very anecdotal information. The NRCS was incredibly pleased when we took this approach because they felt that it was much more objective analysis of where they needed to go out and identify and perform these DSRs. Now, what happens in the post fire environment is you get what I call a lot of point of impact projects, where we're looking at protecting things at the site of impact. Um, and that's okay. Sometimes that causes problems downstream. For example, if you're armoring a bank or sandbagging it, you're accelerating flows through a certain area, and then all of a sudden you're causing massive erosion and sedimentation downstream. I've even seen it cause problems upstream. Um, and so that's the whole point in the action plan before a fire so that we can look at better strategies and employ these point of impact strategies with other ones. Now, this is the fire across the divide that also burned in 2020, the Cameron Peak fire. And one of the approaches was aerial mulching. Now, aerial mulching last year in Colorado was $2,500 an acre. Some people think that's cheap. I think it is unbelievably expensive when you're looking at a 200,000 acre fire. I think that there needs to be a lot of prioritization about where this mulch is dropped, and it needs to be dropped in areas above values at risk, like reservoirs, other things. A global approach to aerial mulching, I don't think the cost benefit is there. The science shows that it speeds up recovery. It does nothing to help downstream communities when you've got a storm that sets up and drops a quarter of an inch or a half inch of rain in a half hour or an hour. We still see pretty big debris flows coming off these areas with the mulch. But anyway, those are things that we'd like to plan ahead of time. And we'd also like to know the condition of our riparian areas. And this, what looks like a beaver wetland complex, it didn't do a great job of serving as a fire break. You can see that in the picture here. But we don't know what the condition was before the fire. We don't know if beavers were in there before the fire. There was certainly nothing in there after it. But these are areas that we'd like to know about before the fire so that we can enhance them or restore them so that they can function better. We're fortunate enough to have some brilliant geomorphologists, hydrologists, and ecologists in our state. Dr. Ellen Wool being one of those from Colorado State University. And she's got some papers out there where she talks about beads and strings. And basically these beads they're depositional areas that, and I've really simplified her language here. So if you can read some of these papers, I encourage you to do it. But these are depositional areas that naturally slow the flow of water. So thinking back to protecting our flow regime. And they hold sediment and wood. And they hold carbon too, which isn't a primary objective of this program, but it's important to note. And they provide increased habitat. We used to have a lot of them on our landscape, and due to anthropogenic events, different reasons, we don't have too many anymore relative to what we had historically. I don't think we'll ever get back to where we are historically. Our prior appropriation system, how we administer our water in this state would be prohibitive of that. But we can do a lot better than where we are right now. And we need to be thinking about it in a way that protects our downstream values at risk. So I talked about how we dovetail into other programs we have. I've been administering the Colorado Watershed Restoration Program for the state of Colorado for 15 years. I actually wrote this program in 2008 and received about $250,000 for it. Since then, we've administered about $150 million out of this program for stream restoration projects, post-fire recovery projects, post-flood projects. And what we're looking here in the two big pictures on the left and right is it's a wet meadow restoration project with beaver dam analogs, post-assisted log structures. I like to call them twigs, temporary wood grade structures. That gets the consumptive water users a little less twitchy in our state when we talk about them that way. And then on the bottom, I've got different examples of types of restoration projects we've done over the years. You can see a mine tailings in the valley there. That I call that one a river resurrection project, where the tailings were removed, and a new channel was built, and we do diversion reconstruction for fish passage and boat passage. And the middle left there is a alluvial fan reconstruction in a post-wildfire scenario, where we're kind of encouraging these braided channels on the fan so we get a lot of material to deposit there. We also do gully stabilization. Then I got a couple examples of our post-flooding from 2013 on some of the stabilization we've done with wood structures. So a lot of these types of projects are projects that I would encourage before fires, but done strategically in locations where we know we're going to have these hazards and we have significant values at risk downstream. This is kind of what it looks like in the natural environment. Part of developing a wildfire-ready action plan would be identifying areas that we think will function really well after a fire, and even divert during a fire. These could influence our suppression strategies, but they'd also get us thinking about how we work with our land trusts to protect these areas. And sometimes they need enhancement. Like I said at the beginning of the slideshow, we have a lot of underachievers out there that need to be reconnected with the floodplain before they'll function well for us. Here's our website. I really encourage you guys to have a look at it. Joe, if we have time, we could kind of cruise around on it real quick to show you some of the better resources on it. But on the top right there, you can see we just have a few tabs. We like to keep these things real simple. The statewide study results with the Explorer are there. The action plan for the locals is there, and that includes links to the grant program as well as the template scope of work. And then we have a resource tab that it has all those fact sheets, but it also has a fact sheet that further explains our data sets and where we got those from.